Welcome to Angels and Seerstones. I'm Christine.
And I'm Chris.
Today we're talking about apparitions in the temple.
These experiences of seeing the dead tell us about temple ritual and our efforts to provide salvation for our deceased loved ones.
It'll be an exciting episode. Stick around.
Latter-day Saints are a people of radical faith. We are a unique body of Bible-believing Christians. For us, the scriptural canon has been opened. The traditional sacraments have expanded. Our beliefs and practices are steeped in universalism, esotericism, and apocalypticism.
The Latter-day Saint tradition is a religion in which angels visit everyday people, and sometimes men and women see the divine in stones. In this podcast, we examine the lived religion of Latter-day Saints, our beliefs, and our stories.
We take seriously the whole gamut of Latter-day Saint experience. Join us, Christine and Chris Blythe,
two professional folklorists and Latter-day Saint converts,
as we openly discuss our faith while exploring the traditions of our chosen people. Anyone who has lost someone holds the hope of seeing or speaking with them again, and not just after this life. If you're LDS, you've likely imagined this reunion occurring in the walls of the temple. One of the most compelling aspects of our faith is the work we perform for our dead. We do it both for our immediate, recently deceased loved ones and long past ancestors. For those who aren't LDS, this means performing rituals such as baptism and proxy of the deceased.
As Latter-day Saints, we typically call these rituals ordinances, and the rationale behind these vicarious ordinances is twofold. First, that God plans on redeeming his children, and that work does not end at death's door. It answers the question of what happens if someone is not given the opportunity to accept Christ in this life, and recognize the vast experiences and circumstances of all people worldwide. The second is that God has called us to follow his example and be baptized. And of course, Latter-day Saints believe there are other salvific rituals necessary for eternal progression. And if someone was unable to accept them in this lifetime, they can do so in the next.
But the key is they need a body. We need bodies to perform ordinances. So in the temple, a living person performs the ritual in the name of someone who has died, and the dead have their agency to decide whether to accept the ritual or not.
So before we get started, let's go over a few essential ordinances that Latter-day Saints participate in throughout their lives. We'll skip those ordinances such as baby blessings or blessings of comfort and healing or patriarchal blessings that are not essential, or something like sacrament, what other churches call the Eucharist or communion, that are sacred but not necessarily salvific. What we're talking about are ordinances such as baptism, confirmation, initiatory rites, what we call washing and anointings, the endowment, and marital and family sealings.
Latter-day Saints attend the temple themselves to receive their initiatory, to be endowed, and to be sealed to their family. And then afterwards, they return to participate in these ordinances on behalf of someone else who's passed on. They immerse themselves in their personal genealogies, and we bring our names plucked from these family trees in order to provide these rituals for those whose bodies are lying on the ground.
Yeah, it's definitely a distinct Latter-day Saint belief and practice. I think it's a powerful one that erases the horrors of literal hellfire. It's an extended act of God's grace. And there are some phenomenal stories about individuals who encounter the dead in the temple. Sometimes there are personal narratives. I've heard a few, although the stories tend to be legend or friend of a friend narratives.
Let's talk about one of the most popular narratives in this genre. This example loosely falls under the umbrella of stories that folklorists have referred to as the legend of the Grateful Dead. These stories date back into antiquity. In the more traditional Grateful Dead narrative, we have a protagonist who protects a corpse from grave robbers or who pays the burial fees of a man now deceased. And as a result, the spirit of the dead rewards the protagonist, and they often do so by saving the protagonist's life.
A lady had gone to the temple for an afternoon session. While in the session, she felt very uneasy and felt like she should return home. She approached one of the temple workers and told him how she felt. He reassured her that if she would just finish the session, everything would be all right at home. She did just that. After the session, she returned home as fast as possible. As she approached her neighborhood, she saw police cars and fire engines all over. She stopped and asked what had happened. They told her that a little girl had fallen into the canal. In a rage of panic, the woman hurried home. She ran to her little girl's room. Standing in the room with water dripping from her was the woman's little girl. When she asked the little girl what happened, this is how she responded. I fell into the canal, and then a lady picked me up out of the water and carried me to my room. The little girl told her mother the woman's name. It was the same name as the one this mother had done temple work for that afternoon.
Yeah, it's a really neat story that reflects that ongoing relationship between the living and the dead. And of course, as mentioned, this is a core Latter-day Saint theology. In the story we just heard, that woman's experience in the temple results in the preservation of her child's life.
You know, there's one version of this story in which it's the child's grandmother that comes to save her. But I really like this, what I think is an earlier account, where it's the person that's actually having work done for them in the temple that feels so grateful that they're looking out for the family. And in these stories, not all spirits are pleased with those who visit the temple. The next stories occur in an endowment ceremony, or what we typically call a session. For those of you who are endowed, you'll know the setting well. For those of you who have not been endowed, much of the session is still and contemplative. You are sitting and watching as a ritual drama unfolds.
So there's an expectation that participants express a degree of reverence towards the ordinances and towards others in the room. This story that we're about to tell was recorded by a BYU folklore student in 1996, Tara Draper, and she spoke with Mary Beth Long, who shared this story, in which she originally heard it from a religion professor named Byron Merrill. Here it is. Well, Brother Merrill heard this from a woman in his ward, who heard it from another woman in the same ward, who supposedly it happened to. She went to the temple one day with a friend, and they were running so late that they just slipped in and sat all the way in the back. They sat in the back next to these two other women. I guess they had heard the endowment so many times that they weren't really focused, and they were just kind of chatty. Towards the end of the session, the lady next to them turns and tapped the lady on the shoulder and asked her to be quiet. She's agitated, and she says, "Would you mind being quiet? I have waited hundreds of years for this." Then she and her companion got up and walked out of the room through the walls. The original woman was understandably, I think, feeling really guilty. Of course, the message here is that reverence isn't simply for the living, that the deceased, like their living counterparts, are seeking after sacred experiences. I think this could also be read as a way to reinforce the cultural rules of LDS worship that are prevalent in and outside of the temple. A cautionary tale of how our sincerity and conformity, or lack thereof, might have a negative impact that bleeds from mortality into the realm of the dead.
The next story I want to share is one that I first heard as a missionary serving in Sissonville, West Virginia. I think I've mentioned Sissonville before. This is a town outside Charleston where dozens of Latter-day Saint families gathered to build their homes around a single LDS chapel. I served there in 2006. At the time, the ward largely consisted of members between the ages of 60 and 80. So for me, it was a special place because there were so many rich stories being told about sacred Latter-day Saint belief and experience.
Sounds like a gold mine for Latter-day Saint community folklore.
It was. You know, I remember sitting with an elderly woman. She's now passed. Her name was Betty June. She served at the time as a temple worker in Raleigh, North Carolina. And she explained to me once that when someone fell asleep during an ordinance, and this happens from time to time, we know that the deceased wouldn't be able to see the ordinances.
Okay, this is almost like positive possession, as if the proxy ceremony is efficacious because the spirit literally inhabits a body. I'm thinking like Whoopi Goldberg in the movie Ghost.
I actually think proxy work is more like power of attorney. Earlier when we first read the story, you said it was almost like the body, the eyes are like a window for the spirit to see out of. This isn't typically how we think of it. The dead is no longer able to fulfill a needed requirement of salvation. So the proxy, the living, does it in their behalf. But it really is that power of attorney idea, not the idea of a possession. Of course, I love Betty June's belief that it requires more from the living than simply showing up.
Absolutely. That Latter-day Saints need to make sacred and take seriously these experiences is important, I think.
Right, and we have other stories like this in circulation. This next legend was actually collected by Dennis Ray Cutchins, who's currently a BYU literature professor. He initially collected this story in 1989 when he was just 25 years old. This was likely collected while taking a course with folklorist Bert Wilson during his tenure at BYU. And at the time, Dennis had only been married for 3 months to a fellow student, Mary Ann. The couple had just visited the temple when Marianne shared with Dennis this story.
And after a trip to the temple, you might talk to your partner or your roommate or your mission companion about experiences at the temple or temple legends or your own interpretation of the ritual. And this in the same way that you tell ghost stories at a sleepover or around a campfire, but not usually at a business luncheon or a school function. Anyways, okay, here it is. This lady was going to the temple, and she was really tired. She'd seen everything a million times and was kind of not paying attention, and she fell asleep during the part of a session. As she was leaving the temple, she was walking down the hallway, and there was this lady sitting in a chair, and she was crying like her heart would break. The lady felt so bad that she stopped and asked what was wrong, and was there anything she could do to help. The other lady just looked at her and said, "You just went through the temple for me, and you slept through the session, so I didn't hear everything that was said." The lady felt so bad, and she apologized and went back through for her again so that she could hear.
That's really interesting. What Betty June told me was that being asleep prevented the dead from seeing the ceremony. In the Cutchin story, sleep prevents the dead from hearing the ritual. So this is such an unusual story because we don't typically think of ourselves as being possessed.
Yeah, I think it's more common for Latter-day Saints to imagine the deceased as standing at the doorway or sitting nearby or hovering overhead.
And this is why I found a story that a friend shared with me just this week so interesting. It's the same experience, someone falling asleep in the temple and being rebuked by the dead, but the dead is outside of us, but still perturbed that we're falling asleep. This is what the friend wrote. I had an experience that sounds crazy, but it really happened. We were doing an endowment session one evening, and as was quite often the case because I got up so early in the morning to go to work, I was having a difficult time to stay awake during the film part of the session. I had this feeling it was really important to stay awake, and I even said a silent prayer that I could stay awake. But I was really fighting going to sleep. I kept closing my eyes, nodding, opening my eyes. Finally, at one point, I obviously had dozed off and didn't even realize it, despite the urgency to stay awake. And all of a sudden, I felt my ear flicked, like when you flick someone's ear with your finger, and distinctly heard an unhappy voice say to me, "Wake up." I woke up and thought, wow, I can't believe the guy sitting next to me actually flicked my ear. I turned and looked at him, and he was sound asleep. Needless to say, I stayed awake the rest of that session. Let's share one more variant of this legend that goes so far as to say, if you fall asleep, the ceremony doesn't count.
Yikes. 3 ladies were walking home after going to the temple when a 4th came up and addressed one of them. "Would you please go through the temple for me?" "Of course. What is your name?" When she told her name, another of the ladies said, "Why, I did your work this morning." The stranger replied, "Yes, but you went to sleep."
Let's end with a legend cycle that has wide circulation among members of the church. Perhaps this is a family legend within your own line, or maybe you've experienced something like it. It takes place in a sealing room, a setting where a man and woman kneel across an altar to be united for time and all eternity and receive the blessings of that covenant. This is a particularly old version of this story, but it's been repeated many times. This is recorded in a temple book from the 1890s. It's currently restricted at the Church History Library, but at different times has been open for researchers. And this story is from a woman named Amanda Wilcox.
Sister Amanda H. Wilcox was in the temple, assisting in the ordinances of sealing children to their parents, when she saw an angel. On October 26, 1896, the record asserts that Sister Amanda H. Wilcox saw the dead father of those children standing by the altar, and he intimated to her that he and his wife, the mother of the children, had not yet been sealed. Sister Wilcox went immediately to President Winder, who was officiating, and notified him about the information the angel had given her. He immediately called a halt to the work. After a careful examination of the record, President Winder discovered that the angel was correct. The sealing had inadvertently been overlooked. Husband and wife were then sealed, and afterward, the children were sealed to their parents.
I am deeply moved by Amanda Wilcox's story, and there are many like it. Often it's a series of spirit children waiting in line next to the baptismal font. Sometimes two are forgotten. Someone is able to see these remaining children and alerts the officiator, which leads to their baptism, of course. This is really moving, and it reminds us that the work in the temple occurs on both sides of the veil, something that's been emphasized by Russell M. Nelson, shows up in official doctrine, and of course it shows up in our stories.
Absolutely. These narratives are really powerful. They remind us that the divide between the dead and the living is tenuous, and that the relationship between the two necessary, and more importantly, enduring. For me, this theology is perhaps the most profound of all Latter-day Saint theology, that God is invested in eternally securing the relationships that I find most valuable in this life, that death does not sever the Father's promise to his children, that we are his work in his glory, and that we can be perfected in him in this life or the next.
Thank you for joining us this week. Angels and Seerstones is a labor of love. We want to help Latter-day Saints appreciate their incredible culture, and we want to hear and share your stories as well. If you have the time, please subscribe, rate the podcast, and write up a review. And most importantly, join us next time when we discuss stories about shaking hands with angels. We'll see you then.
See you then. Angels and Seerstones is a proud member of the Dialogue Podcast Network. You can support this podcast and others in our network by subscribing at dialoguejournal.com.